Do you know that the vicious, bloodthirsty Vikings we see in pop culture today were primarily agriculturalists who grew crops and reared animals at their settlements? Well, you are in for some Scandinavian history, as we will look at the admirable culture of the Vikings of ancient times, as well as the bad and heinous ones. In this video, we will explore some of the practices the Vikings were popularly known for, like their voyaging, raiding, and pillaging lifestyle, their portrayal of gender roles, and even some of their obscene human mistreatments. Stick around to learn more about this unique civilization, and let us see what your perception of them will be. Who knows, you might end up admiring them way more than you used to, or you might want to leave the Viking fandom. But as a warning, keep an open mind as you watch on. We don't want you freaking out after learning that the Vikings were notable dragon slayers who drank from the skulls of vanquished enemies while sailing across the seas. Antsy yet? You should be. But relax, that was just a lie. The Vikings did not slay dragons, or ever meet them, and did not drink from human skulls, but they were indeed seafaring experts. If anything, this very attribute was one of their strongest suits. We all know how the Vikings have been romanticized in the media as heroic seamen who sailed across seas, raiding, plundering, and pillaging. For the record, they did in fact commit all those acts and many more, but can we really say they were heroic? You will be the judge of that after we explore the good, bad, and the ugly of the Vikings. So let's get down to business. A stereotypical Viking is a sturdy blonde or redhead man with a full beard, a big sword, horns, and a helmet. Well, most of that description is accurate. The Vikings were typically fellows with fair skin and hair color that varied between red, black, and blonde. However, they never wore horned helmets or acted like barbarians who lacked all sense of morality. On the contrary, they had a lot of good traits. As earlier said, the Vikings were excellent seafarers. They had sturdy longboats that were made with an engineering marvel that rivaled their time. With these boats, they sailed across tidal waves with great speed and dexterity and covered great distances in the Atlantic. This was how they could explore, trade, and raid cultures far and wide in Europe and beyond. In fact, their maritime exploration was so intense that they were the first Europeans to discover North America, long before Christopher Columbus sighted the continent. Another good trait of the Viking society was their flair for trading. The Vikings were good traders. In fact, contrary to popular culture, they spent most of their time trading rather than raiding and killing. With their high-quality longboats, the Vikings explored many areas and established trading networks and routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Arctic seas. They traded with neighboring cultures when raiding and pillaging did not seem like the better option. As merchants, they traded weapons, ivory, salt, fur, cloth, and wool, and even slaves, in exchange for spices, wine, silk, glass, and many more products found primarily in Europe and Asia. They were so remarkable in trading that they excelled at changing the blandest and most barren areas into thriving trade centers. Now, that is something they don't show you often in the media concerning Vikings. The Vikings were also quite literate as a civilization. They could read and write runes, and much of what has been found carved on stones today is what we have used to understand a bit of the Viking society. If you don't find that really impressive, then it might interest you to know that the Vikings were exceptional agriculturalists. Regardless of the harsh northern climates that pervaded Scandinavia in those times, the Vikings were still skilled enough to raise livestock and cultivate crops. Through these means, they were able to trade their surplus produce with their trading partners in order to eke out a living. Then, outside their community, they sought to expand their agricultural strength. This got so serious that rather than raiding and pillaging, the Vikings would seek out concessions in the form of land. From then henceforth, Viking settlements were more about gaining wealth, especially in the form of usable agricultural lands. In addition, the Vikings were skilled craftsmen who could create their own metalwork, textiles, and wooden arts, and they exported these goods in their trading centers worldwide. In all, the Vikings were an independent community, with members who embraced individualism and personal freedom. This was evident in the fact that they never sought political dominance within and outside their community. In essence, the Vikings did not seek to expand their territories or create Viking empires or colonies. Instead, they consolidated their state power into a council of free men, rather than one ruler to make democratic decisions for the community. These traits are impressive and give Vikings the respect they deserve as a community. However, there are some dark sides in Viking society, and you might find them appalling. One of these bad sides is their violence and barbaric nature. It is just as they have been portrayed in the media. The Vikings were raiders who went about on conquests. They pillaged and plundered other foreign communities and made a lot of spoils such as goods, silver, jewelry, and slaves. But the irony of the whole thing is that Viking raids were not always intended to destroy people or their lifestyles, even though that was the very thing that happened after every raid. In some instances, they did this in order to get resources for their survival, as was the case for many empires and civilizations during those times. However, the history books were not interested in buying this justification, so their violent and brutal nature preceded their reputation as farmers and traders. Another bad side of the Vikings worth noting was their notorious use of slavery. They got their captives from their raids and used them as either concubines or laborers. In some cases, these enslaved captives were sold as commodities to other communities during trade deals. It did not make it all the more better that women and children were most affected by this act. Lastly, the Vikings were not religiously tolerant people. Although they had such vigor for their own pantheon of gods and goddesses, they had little tolerance for the religion and beliefs of other cultures. In turn, they often got into conflicts with Christians, and they proved this point by attacking churches and monasteries. They did this and believed such attacks would give them power and wealth. Now that we have seen the good and the bad of the Vikings, let us dive into the ugly. And on this note, our special mention goes to the dreaded execution practice that was popular among the Vikings, the blood eagle execution. This was an execution style where the victim's ribs were cut away from their spine, their lungs were pulled out, and their backskin was draped over their shoulders to create the appearance of a wing. It was actually speculated that such a punishment was meted out only to people who had committed heinous crimes or as a form of revenge. That is ugly, right? Well, you can ease up a bit. There is no scientific or archaeological backing for such an execution style, so we can't know whether this was actually practiced. What we do know, however, is the Vikings' treatment of women, and this will sum up the ugly side of Viking society. Assault and sexual violence against women were as common with the Vikings as it is in modern society, and also women accused of adultery and other crimes, no matter how little, were either publicly shamed or executed, primarily by being burnt at the stake. Women in these societies were only relegated to household duties, and their value as women was measured based on their ability to give birth. This was not entirely new because gender roles have been an age-long phenomenon since medieval times. If the treatment of women does not pass as enough credit for the ugly side of the Vikings, then the blood eagle execution and their habits of raiding and pillaging might be an excellent fit.